In April 2026, the United States Supreme Court quietly closed a door. The last major lawsuit accusing the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints of tithing fraud was rejected. No hearing, no review, just a one-line denial. And with that, every legal challenge to how the church handles its money was over. All of them dismissed. That same month at General Conference, a church leader stood at the pulpit and told 17 million members that paying tithing is how you prove you are not double-minded, that God must come first. That sacrifice brings spiritual power. 2 events, same month. One church that just won every financial battle in court, and one message that the donations must keep coming. This is not a video about whether tithing is right or wrong. This is a video about what the numbers actually say in 2026, what a former prophet once promised about a day like this, and why the future of Mormon tithing might look nothing like its past. Part 1. To understand where tithing stands in 2026, you have to understand what just ended. For nearly 7 years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faced a wave of lawsuits. They all traced back to one man, David Nielsen, a former senior portfolio manager at Ensign Peak Advisors, the church's private investment arm. In 2019, Nielsen went to the IRS and to the press with a stunning claim. The church, he said, had quietly accumulated over $100 billion in investments, and almost none of it was being spent on charity. That single allegation triggered everything that followed. Laura Gaddy and 2 other former members sued the church in 2019, alleging fraud and racketeering. James Huntsman, brother of a former Utah governor, filed his own lawsuit in 2021, demanding the return of $5 million he had donated as a member. A proposed class action case followed in Utah. More suits popped up in California, Illinois, Washington, Texas, and Tennessee. Every single one was dismissed. The Huntsman case went all the way to the 9th Circuit, where an 11-judge panel unanimously rejected it. The Gaddy case climbed through the 10th Circuit and was denied at every level, and in April 2026, the Supreme Court declined to hear it. That was the last one standing. The legal argument, in every case, hit the same wall. Federal courts ruled that deciding whether the church misrepresented how it would use tithing would require judges to interpret religious doctrine, and under the First Amendment, courts will not do that. So the lawsuits revealed a great deal about the church's finances. But they changed nothing about its obligations. The church emerged from 7 years of legal scrutiny without a single ruling against it. And that raises a question most members have never considered. If the courts cannot compel transparency, and the church is not legally required to disclose its finances in the United States, then who decides whether the current system is working? The members do. And that is where this story gets complicated. Part 2. Here is what the lawsuits did bring to light. Ensign Peak Advisors, the church's Salt Lake City-based investment fund, filed its first public disclosure with the Securities and Exchange Commission in early 2020. At that point, its stock portfolio was valued at $37.8 billion. By the end of 2024, that number had climbed to $56.8 billion, a 5-year high. But the stock portfolio is only part of the picture. Independent analysts at the Widow's Mite report, who have tracked church finances using public data and modeling for years, estimate the church's total net worth at approximately $265 billion as of 2023. That includes real estate holdings around the world, agricultural operations, commercial ventures, and the Ensign Peak Fund itself. To put that in perspective, the church's investment income now exceeds what it receives from member donations. The Widow's Mite analysis estimates that members contribute between $5.5 and $6.5 billion annually in tithing. The investment portfolio generates more than that on its own in a good year, and it keeps growing. At current rates of return, the church's total financial holdings could reach $1 trillion by 2044. That is not a projection from critics. That is a mathematical extrapolation from publicly filed data. In 2023, the SEC fined Ensign Peak $4 million and the church $1 million for using shell companies to hide the size of the portfolio from regulators between 1997 and 2019. The church settled, paid the fine, and moved on. The SEC's own documents noted that church leadership approved the concealment strategy because they were concerned about the negative consequences of people finding out how large the portfolio had become. Now here is the part that matters for tithing. The church has always maintained that Ensign Peak's fund consists of earnings on invested tithing, not tithing itself. But analysis by Widows Mite, based on SEC filings from 2003 and 2004, suggests that Ensign Peak was a net buyer of stocks during the period when money was transferred to fund the City Creek Center Mall in downtown Salt Lake City. If the fund was buying, not selling, during that window, then the money that went to City Creek likely came from accounts that did contain actual tithing. The church spent approximately $1.4 billion on City Creek between 2010 and 2014. It also transferred $600 million to prop up a financially struggling insurance company called Beneficial Life. Whether you call that tithing or earnings on tithing depends on a distinction that even financial analysts struggle to draw clearly. But here is what is not ambiguous. The church has more money than it has ever had in its entire history, and the question of whether it still needs 10% of every member's income is no longer hypothetical. It is mathematical. Part 3. If you watched the April 2026 General Conference, you heard the church's answer. Elder Jorge T. Becerra, a General Authority 70, delivered a talk focused entirely on tithing. His message was built around a single concept: double-mindedness. He described it as wavering commitment, spiritual instability, a lack of focus. And his prescription was clear: pay your tithing. Put God first. Offer the firstlings of your flock, just as Adam did. He shared his mother's testimony that God blesses those who keep the law of tithing, even in hardship. He testified that spiritual power comes through obedience and sacrifice. The message was sincere, personal, and consistent with over a century of church teaching on the subject. But it was also delivered in a very specific context. A context where the church's own investment arm holds more than $50 billion in stocks alone. Where the total institutional wealth is estimated at $250 billion. Where the Supreme Court had just days earlier ended the last legal challenge to how that wealth was accumulated. And this is not the first time a church leader has acknowledged the tension. In 2022, Elder David Bednar spoke at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. When asked about poor members paying tithing given the church's wealth, his response was striking. He said the church does not need their money, but those people need the blessings that come from following God's commandments. That framing is important. It shifts the purpose of tithing from institutional need to individual spiritual development. The church is not asking for money because it needs the money. It is asking because the act of giving is, in its theology, what makes you faithful. For believing members, that is a deeply meaningful distinction. For those questioning the system, it raises a different kind of concern. If the church does not need the money, then tithing is not a donation. It is a test. And the consequences of failing that test are real. Members who do not pay a full tithe cannot receive a temple recommend. Without a temple recommend, they cannot participate in the church's most sacred ordinances. They cannot be sealed to their families for eternity. That is not a small thing in a faith where eternal family bonds are the central promise. Part 4. There is another number most members never see, and it may matter more than any investment portfolio. While the church reports total membership growth of roughly 1% per year, independent analysis tells a different story beneath the surface. The Widows Mite report, using 3 separate data sets including member donations in 5 countries with mandatory financial reporting, national surveys, and male missionary service rates, found that active membership appears to have been declining since 2016. The church reports over 17 million members worldwide. But when you look at ward-level data and congregational statistics, the numbers imply somewhere between 3.8 and 5.4 million active members globally. That means roughly 70 to 80% of people counted as members are not actively participating. And the financial data tells a parallel story. In the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Netherlands, where churches are required to disclose financial information, tithing participation rates have been falling. Fewer members are paying. And among those who do pay, the question of what tithing means is increasingly unsettled. In January 2026, the Salt Lake Tribune published a commentary by an active, believing member who described her own struggle with tithing. She called it a regressive practice, one where the poorest and wealthiest members are asked to contribute the same percentage. She acknowledged that she has no decision-making authority over where her tithing goes, and she admitted being tempted to let someone who has benefited more pick up the tab. She still pays, but her honesty reflects a conversation that is happening quietly across the church. Members are not necessarily leaving over tithing, but they are thinking about it differently. And the church's response so far has been to double down on the spiritual framing rather than address the financial math. Which brings us to the part of this story that almost nobody talks about anymore. In April 1907, the president of the church stood at General Conference and made a statement that, over a century later, reads like a prophecy that already came true. Joseph F. Smith, the sixth president, told members that the church had finally paid off all its debts, that it could now pay as it goes without borrowing. And then he said something remarkable. He said he expected to see the day when the church would not have to ask members for $1 of donation for any purpose except what they volunteered to give of their own accord, because the church would have tithes sufficient in the storehouse of the Lord to pay everything needful for the advancement of the kingdom of God. He said that was the true policy and the true purpose of the Lord in the management of the affairs of His church. That was 1907. The church was just coming out of crippling debt. Joseph F. Smith was describing a future where financial self-sufficiency would free members from compulsory giving. A future where tithing would become voluntary, not required. In 2026, the church has $265 billion. Its investment income exceeds its tithing revenue. It could fund its entire global operation from investment returns alone and never ask another member for $1. By any financial measure, the day Joseph F. Smith described has arrived, and yet tithing remains a requirement for temple worthiness. The annual tithing declaration meeting still happens every December, and at General Conference, leaders still teach that paying your 10% is how you prove your faith to God. The future of Mormon tithing is not going to be decided in a courtroom. The Supreme Court made that clear. It is not going to be decided by journalists or analysts either. The church has no legal obligation to change anything. The future of tithing will be decided by the members themselves, by whether the next generation sees tithing the same way their grandparents did, by whether a church with more wealth than most countries can continue to frame 10% as a spiritual necessity rather than an institutional choice, and by whether a promise made in 1907 by a man the church considers a prophet will ever be honored. The numbers are public now. The lawsuits are over. The wealth is real. The only question left is what happens next.